Welcome to the third event in our virtual Read the Revolution Speakers Series, sponsored by the Haverford Trust Company. I am Scott Stevenson. I am the president and CEO of the Museum of the American Revolution. I'm coming to you live from just outside the Founders Boardroom at the museum, located in beautiful Old City, Philadelphia. I'm just 2 blocks from Independence Hall. The first little hints of spring are popping out. And so I decided to break out my blue blazer this evening. So welcome. It's wonderful to have you all here. I think we have just under 100 people registered for tonight's event. We have at least 46 members on with us this evening. We have people tuning in. We know from Massachusetts to Mississippi. We have some students on, and I would love it if you would throw into the chat. Tell us where you're tuning in from. Are you members? Is this your first time joining us for a program here at the museum? So I think it's absolutely wonderful that we're all gathered here this evening. Now, of course, members are able to attend these evening lectures like Read the Revolution as part of the benefits of their membership. And so I hope that for those of you who are joining us for the first time, or maybe you've attended a few of our events, and even if you're not sure how often you'll be able to visit the museum physically this year, I hope that you'll consider becoming members to support our mission and to join this wonderful virtual community that we have gathering increasingly on these wonderful events like this evening. Now, Read the Revolution speaker series is more than one thing, and we're very grateful to the Haverford Trust Company for being a longtime supporter of the museum, and particularly for underwriting Read the Revolution. So what are the components of Read the Revolution? Well, first and foremost, events like you're witnessing tonight, both physical, in-person evening lecture series, and now the virtual versions that we're doing tonight. And as we move into what we hope will be the new normal after times of the post-pandemic world, we're hoping to not just bring you all back to the museum to be physically present here and to be able to enjoy the camaraderie of one another and interaction in real time with our speakers, but we hope to develop hybrid events so that those of you who are joining us from greater distances will continue to be able to enjoy our evening program. Now, Read the Revolution is also an email that you can receive, and all of you should have received an excerpt from tonight's book by Dr. Cassandra Good. Probably would have come to you yesterday. And if you're not already signed up, if you'll just go to the website, you can sign up for our Read the Revolution email series. So this is a bi-weekly email that you receive. It's a curated excerpt of a book about the American Revolution with a little introductory paragraph. It's a great way to kind of stay in touch with new scholarship and interesting books. And it's just a quick 5-minute read. So it's a great way to start your day every other week. In addition, we have recently started a series that we call Read the Revolution Founding Footnotes. This is for members of our Revolution Society membership group. And if you are interested in taking a little deeper dive into the primary sources that are often buried deep in the footnotes of these wonderful books that we feature in our Read the Revolution series, this is for you. These will be kind of a curated discussion, seminar style, but very, very informal with our professional staff looking at original documents. So the next one's coming up on March 31st, and that Founding Footnotes will bring the Massachusetts Historical Society editor-in-chief Sarah Martin on board with Tyler Putman, who's our Dr. Tyler Putman, our gallery education manager here at the museum, to look at Abigail Adams' Remember the Ladies letter. Now that letter is on display here at the museum as part of our When Women Lost the Vote special exhibition. It's here until April 25th. So if you're anywhere within striking distance of Philadelphia and you're able and comfortable to travel, please consider coming to visit the museum. We're currently open Fridays through Sundays. And that exhibition, again, will be open until the end of April. And that original Remember the Ladies letter that Abigail Adams wrote to John Adams here in wrote it to him as he was attending Congress here in Philadelphia, has returned to Philadelphia for the first time since 1776. So if you come see it, come see it. If you'd just like to dig into the history around that letter, Founding Footnotes is a great opportunity for you to do that. Now, Tonight's program with Dr. Cassandra Good, Cassie, as I know her as a good friend, is a perfect complement to our special exhibition, When Women Lost the Vote, a Revolutionary Story. Now, the exhibition, which opened in the fall and runs through the end of April in its physical manifestation here at the museum, also has a very robust website. So a web exhibit, again, you go to our website, amrevmuseum.org, scroll down to digital resources, and you're in. And this includes all of the material that you would digitize that you would see here at the museum, but videos, essays, an interactive poll list where you can explore the biographies of these original women voters and men and women of color, free men and women of color, who our curators discovered in this amazing new piece of scholarship about a little known aspect of voting in the early republic. Now, of course, tonight's program is a great way to kick off Women's History Month. And if any of you are educators, or if you have any educators in your network who might be interested in a professional development opportunity, on March 11th, so coming up just later in the week, Dr. Karen Wolf, who's the director of the Omohundro Institute of Early American History and Culture at William & Mary in Williamsburg, is going to lead a teacher professional development program that's inspired by her award-winning book, Not All Wives, Women of Colonial Philadelphia. And there's still a few slots open for that. Again, if you just go to the website, look under events, and on March 11th, click on that, and you have an opportunity to contact the museum and see if you're able to participate. We have a lot of programs there. I really encourage you to check it out. We're doing a ton of virtual programming. One of the things I'm extremely excited about is on March 25th, Dr. Melissa Dunphy, and you probably saw, for those of you who joined early, Dr. Dunphy's slide probably rotated through. She's a great friend of the museum, member of the museum, lives just a few blocks away. Has a PhD in composition from the University of Pennsylvania. And she will be unveiling on the 25th a new choral piece commissioned by the Museum of the American Revolution that sets the text of Abigail Adams' letter to a beautiful piece of choral music. Now, this program is being offered as a pay-as-you-wish program, and there'll be a special kind of pre-party, virtual pre-party, where we'll be launching a new Young Friends membership group. So if any of you are young, if any of you have young friends, if you would like to be young friends of the museum, again, just go to the website, look, go to the calendar, click on that program with Melissa Dunphy on March 25th, and we would love for you to join with us in good friendship. Now, on May the 20th will be our next Read the Revolution speaker series. That will end our spring series. That's when Dr. Linda Colley from just across the river in New Jersey at Princeton will be talking about her new book, The Gun, the Ship, and the Pen, which is a kind of global history looking at constitution writing, and it ranges from the 18th century to the present day. It's a really new provocative work of scholarship, and I know that you'll want to be part of that. Now, final point of order before we get on to some of the introductions here. At the end of tonight's program, you'll get an email with a Survey Monkey link. I hope that you'll take just a moment to fill that out, to give us some feedback on tonight's program. Tell us what we did right, tell us what we did wrong, tell us what we could do better, make suggestions about what would you like to hear in terms of topics, in terms of speakers, anything else that you'd like to share with the museum. That data we take very seriously, and we really appreciate your willingness to share with us. Now, before I introduce formally Dr. Good, I'd like to introduce Michael Maxwell, who's the portfolio manager at the Haverford Trust Company, who's just going to say a few words to welcome us here for the evening. And Mike, are you joining us? There he is.
I am, Scott. Thank you. And good evening, everyone. As Scott mentioned, my name is Mike Maxwell. And in addition to being a portfolio manager at the Haverford Trust Company, I'm a very proud member of the museum's Young Leadership Council. And representing Haverford tonight, obviously we're coming to you as a sponsor of this exciting series. We're a wealth management firm based in Radnor with $11 billion in assets under management. And as Scott alluded to earlier, we've enjoyed a very long and successful partnership with the museum, and just remain humbled with the privilege to continue to support their mission. Very excited to hear Dr. Cassandra Good's remarks this evening. Her work is brilliant. Founding Friendships is certainly a piece that absolutely transcends time. So on behalf of Haverford Trust, thank you. And thank you, Scott, for the opportunity to sponsor this series. And thank you to everyone for joining this event virtually. And I know that you'll enjoy the event this evening. So hoping you and wishing you all the best.
So now, finally, without further ado, it's my pleasure to introduce our good friend, my good friend, Dr. Cassandra Good. I first got to know Cassie actually when she was here in Philadelphia, where she received her PhD from the University of Pennsylvania. She is also a graduate with a BA and MA in American Studies from George Washington University down in Washington, D.C. She's currently assistant professor of history at Marymount University in Arlington. She has also served as associate editor of the papers of James Monroe at the University of Mary Washington, and is a specialist in the early Republic period, late 18th century, early 19th century, in particular, writing and doing research very broadly in the fields of politics and gender and cultural history in particular. One of the things I really appreciate about Cassie is that she is a very public-facing historian. She's very active on social media. You should follow her on Twitter, as I do. She writes quite frequently about museums, works in new media. She writes frequently for the Smithsonian, smithsonian.com, and other public venues. So it's not just sort of working and speaking to a small group of scholarly colleagues, as important as that work is, but really has a kind of public-facing, public historian orientation that I appreciate very much. Now, her first book, which is the subject of her introductory remarks this evening, I think I'm getting this good, Founding Friendships, is available through Oxford University Press, and I'd highly recommend it. It received the Organization of American Historians Nicholas Prize in Women's in Gender History in 2016. And we're going to hear a little bit toward the end of the talk about Cassie's new project, which it actually began with the first time that we met, and has a great connection to a lot of the stories that we tell in the museum here. But without further ado, please join me in welcoming Dr. Cassandra Good to Read the Revolution.
Thank you, Scott. It is great to be here. I wish I could be there with you in person. I'm lucky enough to have gotten to go to the museum a few times before we all went into quarantine, and it is wonderful. So I definitely recommend stopping by for a visit. And I'm really excited to get to talk about this book, especially as part of the current exhibit that is up at the museum right now about women and politics, and a pretty surprising story about women who could actually vote in New Jersey between late 18th century, early 19th century. So I'm going to talk to you tonight, and I'm just going to share my screen here so that we can see my PowerPoint. I'm going to talk to you a bit about how I came to write this book and some of the major questions I examine in the book. But throughout, I'm going to try and focus on how women were part of the political system, particularly later in the talk, and also trying to highlight some of the women that, if you go in person to see the exhibit, or if you look at the online exhibit, these will be familiar names, a lot of these women that I am talking about. So how did I come to write a book on friendships between men and women? It actually started with this pair here, Margaret Baird Smith and Thomas Jefferson. I was reading a letter that Margaret Baird Smith wrote to her sister in March 1809, and this is right after Jefferson finishes his second term in office and Madison is coming in. Jefferson is going to leave the Washington area, go down to Monticello, and she has gone to Madison's inaugural party to say goodbye, hello to Madison, but more so goodbye to Jefferson. And she tells her sister, as she's writing, "My eyes are so blinded with tears that I can scarcely trace these lines." And she explains that when she arrived in the president's house, now the White House, "When I saw our dear and venerable Mr. Jefferson, my heart beat. When he saw me, he advanced from the crowd, took my hand affectionately, and held it 5 or 6 minutes. And when I first came across this, actually as an undergraduate, I thought I had discovered a secret affair. And in talking with my advisor, she said, well, people expressed emotion differently then. You can't assume that it's an affair. And I thought, well, so they could be friends, men and women could be friends then. And, I'd seen the movie When Harry Met Sally, but I also knew that I had male friends and that it was possible in my lifetime. So why not then? And so really going into the project, I started with the assumption that friendships between men and women were possible. And I think it's important, along with that, key assumption, to set out a bit about some other assumptions. First of all, my definition of friendship. What do I mean by friendship? I'm talking about affectionate, reciprocal relationships that the people in them called a friendship. And these friendships involve choice. You could choose to enter the friendship or leave it. And that also gives you a certain degree of freedom within the friendship. And I think also, sorry, I'm getting distracted by the chat here. I need to close that off. And let me go back 2 slides here. All right. Unlike in a family or a marital relationship, this choice and freedom to leave here is key, right? You cannot choose to have different family members. And divorce was extremely difficult at this time period. So you couldn't really leave a marriage. So the level of freedom in these relationships actually is the highest level available of any relationship between men and women in this time period. This is mostly between people who are elite, white, fairly wealthy. That is not to say that other people didn't have these relationships, but that the people who left the evidence I was able to find of these relationships come from that class. And I'm hoping that in the future, somebody else tackles trying to find a way to get at these relationships with people of different classes. I do not call these friendships platonic. And there's a particular reason for that. Like, we would call them platonic friendships today. But platonic at the time period meant romantic but unconsummated. So it didn't mean the same thing we mean now. It did have that romantic dimension. So there's not really a great word, and there was no real word or category for these friendships at the time period. But I argue that friendships could be just as central to people's lives then and today as romantic love. And so I structured the book around questions of how these friendships actually worked. And one key question to start with is sort of, what is that line between a romance and a friendship? And what you're seeing here is, it's a little bit earlier than the period I cover in the book, but it's such a good image. It's in Philadelphia at the APS, just down the street from the museum. This is a sketch of Ben Franklin when he's in London with a woman on his lap in a rather compromising position. And so, Franklin is famous for being flirtatious. But, part of what I argue in the book is that flirtation, attraction, that can be part of a friendship. I think even physical intimacy could be. That's pretty hard to get at. Like, we don't generally know because people didn't leave much record of that. But attraction between two people didn't mean this is not a friendship. What we have to look at is, how do people understand the relationship? How do they describe it? How do others around them perceive it? And in some cases, people themselves were a little bit confused about these relationships and sort of where they stood or trying to manage their feelings. One example is a woman you'll see in the exhibit, Judith Sargent Murray, who's an early sort of proto-feminist writer. She had befriended a Unitarian minister named John Murray when she was married to her first husband. And they had been friends for about 12 years. And then her husband passes away, and she writes a letter to her sister-in-law where she says, "I realized my sentiments partook of rather too great a degree of tenderness for Mr. Murray." And she says she tried to repress those feelings. She wanted to stay single. She did not want to remarry. She wanted to just stay friends. That's at least what she told her sister-in-law. She wrote her brother hinting that she had felt that way about Mr. Murray even when she was married to her first husband. It sort of hints, we're not sure. Murray then writes to Judith and, quote, acknowledged he had long loved me, even from the commencement of our acquaintance. So these are two friends that for the first 12 years that they're friends, they are attracted to one another, but they are friends. That is the primary way that that relationship was understood. It seems pretty clear that there was no physical intimacy before that. She's not even admitting to herself how she felt until after her husband dies. They did eventually marry, but if Judith hadn't been widowed, I expect that they would have just stayed friends the rest of their lives. But this really shows us that people at the time could be a little bit confused about their feelings. And part of that confusion is just that society has no good category for these relationships and how to feel in them, right? There were all sorts of etiquette guides, letter writing guides at the time, and none of them talk about friendships between men and women other than to say they were impossible. And I'll get to a little bit more about that in a moment. So I think it's important to consider, if these relationships are that tricky, what do people gain from them? What do they get out of them? Why do they want to be friends with somebody of the opposite sex? And I think there's a number of benefits here. First of all, emotional support and connection, particularly if one friend is older than the other, there's mentorship. They're advising each other, making each other better people, what they would have called then mutual improvement. For younger people of the same age, often they could serve as sort of courtship intermediaries. Men and women who were courting sometimes couldn't write one another. So a friend could sort of step in and be a go-between. There's the intellectual stimulation. Certainly for a lot of the women I'm talking about now who are well-read, well-educated, they're talking about politics, literature, intellectual matters with their male friends. They also could gain surrogate family members through these friendships. People lost loved ones on a sort of tragically regular basis at this point. And these friendships became a way of sort of substituting, whether it's, sometimes a sibling, sometimes a parent role. I'd say most often what you see is that sibling role. One great example of a friendship that embodies a lot of this is Thomas Jefferson's friendship with Abigail Adams. And you were seeing here just how hard to read Abigail Adams' handwriting is. If you go to the event about her Remember the Ladies letter, you'll get to dive more into her handwriting, I'm sure. Fortunately, a lot of her letters are transcribed, so we don't have to read her handwriting that often. But she had met Jefferson in France when John Adams was serving as a diplomat there along with Jefferson. And they really formed an affectionate bond. The relationship also involved shopping. When the Adams moved on to London, Paris was still where the best stuff was, and Jefferson was doing shopping for Abigail. Political advice is part of this relationship in both directions. There are times where Jefferson isn't getting the news he needs from John Adams, and so he's asking Abigail for it. She's a political being and is deeply invested in politics. And their letters, these are fun letters to read. For all that is so problematic about Thomas Jefferson, you read these letters and here he's likable. As is Abigail. They're witty, they're funny, they tease each other, and you can see a real bond between them. That said, even though we see a relationship like this among two very prominent individuals, society still did not look kindly on these relationships. And so I spend a long time in the book talking about how society actually viewed these friendships, looking at literature. I mentioned conduct books, etiquette guides, letter writing guides that basically suggest these relationships are impossible. There's also the fact that the most popular type of novel in this period is the seduction novel. And in those seduction novels, the man often seduces the woman by saying, let's be friends. And usually at the end of those seduction novels, the woman dies. So this is not a good outcome. There's other novels where men and women are friends and they end up falling in love and marrying. And I think that's more in the tradition of maybe When Harry Met Sally are movies today, even literature today. But there was a real danger here that people saw in these relationships. So they had to work to make them appear safe and proper to those around them. One way they do this is by trying to have other third parties involved in the relationship, whether, in a religious community, whether that's God or whether it's a spouse. So with Thomas Jefferson and Abigail Adams, John Adams is also a party to this relationship, and that really embeds the friendship in a broader group. I think that the religious circles are an interesting thing here. Judith Sargent Murray, to go back to her, had told Murray when she was still married to her first husband that it was okay for them to write one another because the soul had no sex. This is something that she talks about a few times, and that a lot of, especially Quakers and evangelical Christians, believed that the soul had no gender or sex. And she said it was safe to mingle souls upon paper, which is a beautiful phrase. That really brings us to letter writing. And if you read the Read the Revolution segment from the museum, you saw a bit of my discussion about this, that people had to be really careful in how they wrote letters. We tend to think, okay, letters are private, they were sealed. You could pretty easily open a wax seal and reseal it. And especially if you were writing abroad, there is no international mail. You have to hand it off to somebody who's going to take it on a ship, who then is going to hand it off to somebody else in Europe, and then get it to your friend. It's passing through a lot of people's hands before it gets to you. And, so they are not just writing these letters for one other person. There's a larger audience in mind in case other people see it. And just because often when somebody received a letter, they were expected to read their family. And I found that you can sort of look at the openings and closings of letters to get some hints about the status of a relationship, that there's a sort of formula. And the emotional vocabulary for a letter between people who are romantically involved is different from friends. So you'll see the use of the person's first name in a romantic letter, in the sign off or at the beginning. So rather than Dear Abigail, these are going to say from Jefferson, Dear Madam. People who are married use words like love and heart. They're just generally more effusive. And what you see in these letters is two sample closings from Jefferson. This top one is to Angelica Schuyler Church of Hamilton musical fame. And this bottom very sort of proper sign off is from George Washington to Annis Boudinot Stockton, who I'll talk about later. But you can see in this letter from Jefferson, he's signing off your affectionate friend. George Washington is being careful to include Martha in his friendship with this woman. And instead of just to a casual acquaintance where he might just say, your most obedient and most humble servant, he adds with great esteem and regard. Right, so that shows that this is a closer friendship. Also the my dear madam. Now, interestingly, one aspect of letter writing between friends is that if the woman is married, the woman in question, she needs her husband's permission to be able to correspond with a man. And in fact, I'll talk a little bit more about Elizabeth Powell in a moment, but there's this great series of letters where George Washington's nephew, Bushrod, that was in fact his name, Bushrod Washington, writes several letters. He's met Elizabeth Powell through his uncle in Philadelphia. He's a young man. So in 1785, he writes several letters to Elizabeth Powell without writing to her husband first. She finally responds and she says, to erase from your mind any suspicion that I am indifferent as to your concerns, I am induced to break through an established rule of never writing to a gentleman that does not correspond with Mr. Powell. I thought your knowledge of what is proper and your attachment to him would have rendered it unnecessary for me to give you any intimations on such a subject. I think she's kidding him, teasing him to some degree here. She's usually not this much of a stickler, but she is signaling like, you broke a rule here. You were supposed to talk to my husband first. Another kind of sort of exchange that I looked at in the book, and really one of my favorite chapters in this book was looking at beyond exchange of letters, exchange of gifts and what kind of gifts people could give one another. And I talk a lot in the book about the exchange of portraits and even of miniatures. I'm just going to highlight two sort of different kinds of gifts today. This is George Washington's hair. His hair exists in a lot of different places. I feel fairly confident this actually was his hair. And this was a gift for Elizabeth Walcott, the wife of General Oliver Walcott, the Treasury Secretary in Washington's second administration. And the story goes that before Washington left the presidency, they were at a party together, and Elizabeth Walcott asked Martha, "Can I have a lock of Washington's hair to remember my friendship with him?" And as the story goes, Mrs. Washington instantly took her scissors, and with a happy smile, cut a large lock from her husband's head, added it to one from her own, and presented them to her friend. Now, we don't see Martha's hair in this piece. Actually, Elizabeth Walcott made 3 different pieces of jewelry from that hair. And you can imagine she's wearing this as a pin. And if anybody asks whose hair it is, that's my friend George Washington, right? She's advertising her friendship with this prominent person. And we might think, well, hair seems like a weird or even overly intimate thing to give. In fact, there's a couple of reasons hair is just fine at this point. One is that you can give it to a lot of different people, right? This is not something like a portrait that you're, or a miniature that you're only giving to somebody you're very intimate with. Friends gave each other locks of hair all the time. You know, it's a renewable resource. It's free, right? And because of that, it's just not as intimate, and it wasn't considered gross to them either, the way we might think of it today. And hair also lasts, right? It doesn't decay. So this is a way to give sort of a piece of yourself that is going to last forever, but is free to a friend. Here's another kind of unusual gift, which is the gift of a poem. I mentioned Anna Stockton, who received that letter that finished off with "My Dear Madam" from George Washington. And before she even met him, she was starting to write poetry about him. And the way they actually met is that she sent some of her poems to him and said, you know, "I thought you would like to read these." And they're basically just poems talking about how wonderful of a leader he is. And they become friends through that exchange of poetry. In fact, he ends up during the Revolution. She lives near Princeton, and he has dinner at her house, and he jokes with her at one point. And there are occasionally blog posts where people will say, "Oh, this letter means he was having an affair with her." He jokes as penance for writing these poems. You know, she's like, "Sorry, I keep writing these effusive poems about you." He says, "Well, we'll have to have dinner together as penance. You'll have to serve me dinner." He's playful with her in a way that we don't see necessarily in a lot of his other letters. And so we can see another side of him here, which is really refreshing, in fact. One other example here of their relationship is he continues writing her even during the Constitutional Convention in 1787. He says, at one point, "I have scarcely a moment in which I can enjoy the pleasures of corresponding with her." So this is a valued friend that really starts through this gift of poetry. So I've talked a lot about political figures here involved in these friendships. So the question is, what do these friendships mean for political life? In fact, all of the founding presidents had female friends, as did many or most elite white men at the time. When a politician is involved, this means there's an exchange of political access, of information, and of influence. And this is a time where personal interactions are really key to politics. You don't have a firm two-party system. There's no party whip that can whip votes. So the way you get people to vote for something is through personal conversations. And in fact, Congress is only sitting for a few months of the year for a few hours a day. Most of politics is happening in people's private homes over tea or dinner. And women are in those spaces. And this means that they have sort of an entry into political life. Women are even in explicitly political spaces like the floor of the Senate. They're sitting there talking to the members as they're debating, giving speeches, getting ready to vote. And I often think of this quote when I think about, you know, what is happening on the floor with those men and women, from Mercy Otis Warren, who was a friend of the Adams and a well-known writer in her own right at this period. She said, "I disregard the opinion the women make but indifferent politicians. When the observations are just and do honor to the heart and character, I think it very immaterial whether they flow from a female lip in the soft whispers of private friendship, or whether thundered in the Senate in the bolder language of the other sex." Right, so this whispering behind the scenes may be harder for us to capture, but nonetheless, it is part of how politics is happening. I've mentioned Elizabeth Powell before and her friendship with Bushrod Washington. And she's also quite important for her friendship with George Washington. She was at the center of political culture in Philadelphia in the 1780s. George Washington was often at her house, as were many others. There's a famous story, which has been quoted a lot recently in the last year, that at the end of the Constitutional Convention, Elizabeth Powell asked Benjamin Franklin about what kind of government they had come up with in the convention. And he replied, "A republic, madam, if you can keep it." And this story was circulating. I mean, this probably happened, and the story of this was circulating in Powell's lifetime. And when she was asked about it years later, she said she didn't really remember this specifically happening, but she had, quote, "associated with the most respectable, influential members of the convention that framed the Constitution, and that the all-important subject was frequently discussed at our house." She's basically saying, I don't remember that specific conversation because I had so many conversations about the Constitution with the people writing it. And she's really at the center of events in Philadelphia at this time. And women like Powell considered themselves in some ways to be female politicians. Powell's friend wrote of her in 1808, so significantly after this point, "I sometimes think her patriotism causes too much anxiety. Female politicians are always ridiculed by the other sex." So this is pointing to the fact that there were people that were uncomfortable with the idea of female politicians. But on the other hand, there are a lot of women that fall into this camp. Among those is Nellie Custis Lewis. This is Martha Washington's granddaughter, George Washington's step-granddaughter, another friend of Elizabeth Powell's as well. And there's a story about Nellie in the exhibition at the museum, supposedly riding to the polls as a teenager and saying, "I own land here, I should be able to vote." And Nellie was very strongly opinionated about politics. She had grown up in the president's house with politicians all around her. And she referred to herself as a politician. She told her friend in 1798, "I am becoming an outrageous politician." And she had very strong Federalist views and very strong anti-French views. In 1802, she told the wife of Thomas Pinckney, who was a prominent Federalist, "I have not yet paid my annual visit to Washington. Indeed, there are too great a number of Democrats there for my person to be comfortable, who has a natural antipathy for those animals." So pretty acerbic about Democrats. She would later refer to President James K. Polk as that reptile Polk. So this is somebody with pretty strong political opinions. And many others have written about political women, and a lot of their work is really key to the exhibit at the museum. And I think it's worth noting that a lot of times these women are functioning in politics through their male friends. So for Nellie, later on, particularly after her grandfather's generation, step-grandfather's generation, she becomes friends with Andrew Jackson and Zachary Taylor when they are president, and has the president's ear in that way. And women like Nellie and Elizabeth Powell were empowered to give advice and share political opinions with male politicians. Powell is perhaps most famous for her letter to George Washington when he's saying, "I think I might not run for a second term as president." And she writes him and says, "There's nobody else that can do the job right now. You have to do it." And, he later says, "Okay, I decided to stay on in part because of some strong words from Philadelphia." Did he mean Elizabeth Powell? They were very close friends. I'm sure that her letter had influence on him. We also see Abigail Adams and Mercy Otis Warren similarly feeling emboldened to influence their male friends in politics. John Adams often sought Mercy Otis Warren's opinions in addition to his wife's, especially during the Revolution. And as we saw before, Abigail Adams often discussed politics with Thomas Jefferson. It was in fact in response to a letter she wrote bemoaning Shays' rebellion, where he said, "I like a little rebellion now and then." This is part of the playfulness in his letters. He partly means it and partly not. And this sort of influence also goes both ways. We can look at this, what I think is pretty remarkable portrait of Eliza Park Custis, Nellie Custis's elder sister. And she was very well connected in Washington when it became the capital city. And a friend of hers named David Bailey Worden, who had been pushed out of his job in a diplomatic post in Europe, is writing to her to talk to politicians, to talk to President Madison, to find out why he lost his job and to help him get it back. So sometimes it is the women actually who are the vectors of power in these friendships. I think in a more abstract sense too, these friendships really represent the values of the Republic. I talked before about choice and freedom in terms of entering and leaving these relationships. There's also, to the greatest degree of any other relationship between a man and a woman at this time, equality, right? Men and women are not equal in society, but in these friendships, there's a level of equality. And finally, virtue. Virtue is this very important key word in the founding period. You need to have a virtuous citizenry. And these friendships that involve, in part, as I said, mutual improvement, are about fostering virtue in each other and supporting the Republic in that way. So where does all of this leave us? I think we tend to think of the founding fathers or the founders in terms of these guys, right? But I think if we want a more complete picture, we need to understand that the politics of this time period is built by both men and women, and that there are roles for women in the politics of this period. And also the fact that at this time, I think we tend to assume that gender roles are narrower in the relationships and what relationships were possible were narrower at this time than they actually were, that the reality is much more flexible. I think that that also points to some messages that we can take for today. This idea that we still have in our society that they had then, that marriage is the ultimate relationship of human fulfillment. I think that that's too narrow. I think what we see here is that people need multiple relationships for happiness. People did then and they do now. And that there are other forms of love between men and women beyond the romantic. And I think that also points to the fact we've really broadened how we talk about categories of gender and sexuality, but not categories of love. And I'd like to see, a broader vocabulary there for talking about different kinds of love, especially between friends. So to wrap up, despite the fact that there are all these risks and restrictions on people in the past that made these friendships challenging, people in the founding generation made these friendships work. And I think that that really leaves a lesson for us about the possibilities for relationships and how we create the fabric of our society today. Thank you.
Oh, wow. Well, I'd encourage anyone who has questions, go ahead and put them in the chat. But boy, my mind immediately started bubbling for a lot of reasons. One of the places in the museum where I always sort of get goosebumps is when I go into the Washington 10 Theater. And of course, those of you who have visited the museum, know what an affecting experience that is. And as you go into the theater that's in the Allen Miller Theater that presents Washington's War Tent, to the right side in the case there is an incredible portrait of George Washington that was done by Joseph Wright in 1784, and it's based on a sitting in the November of 1783 at Rocky Hill in the final weeks of the existence of the Continental Army. It's the place where Washington issued his final orders to the army before coming to Philadelphia, and then of course going to Annapolis to resign his commission. Now that portrait hung until the 1930s in the Powell family home, which is just less than a block from where I'm sitting, just down 3rd Street, and it's an incredible. It's still open as a public museum that you can visit. It's preserved by Philly Landmarks. Actually the upstairs interior woodwork was taken to the Philadelphia Museum of Art and installed. I just was there last weekend to see it. But the original house itself is absolutely worth visiting. And that painting hung there. And as you were talking, my mind kept going back to it. First of all, seeing that magnificent portrait of Mrs. Powell, who has her. I don't know that you had mentioned, but that anecdote about a republic, if you can keep it, has been repeated by many writers over the years. But her name had sort of become detached from it. It was often just said a Philadelphia woman, and so it's been wonderful to, I think, bring that story back together. Also, you mentioned her friendship with Bushrod Washington, and one of the things I really love about that portrait of General Washington is, it's not the most flattering portrait of him. He's got a few of the facial characteristics that I'm starting to notice as I get a little north of 50 years old, and maybe a little bit of the middle-age spread there. But a story that was passed down through the Powell family was that Bushrod Washington, and presumably conveyed this to her, that Washington considered the portrait very like but not flattering, which of course is every vacation photo I've ever just about every photo I think I've ever taken. And so anyway, it just adds, I think, this idea of friendships, a category of friendship in an era in which we tend to assume that there were these sort of rigid definitions, gender definitions, that things were much more fluid then. I also immediately kept going to that scene in the movie Titanic where the women are dismissed so the men can go and talk politics, and of course that may actually represent a later development in sort of gendered ideas about appropriate conversation, but it feels very out of sync with your understanding, our understanding now of at least in this strata of society, how those scenes may have actually played out.
Yeah, and in part, when the capital moves to Washington, it's a little bit different in Philadelphia. Like, there are these salons that have men and women, but in Washington, nobody has a house big enough to have men and women in separate rooms after dinner. So they have to be in the same room hanging out. They can't be in separate rooms. If anybody's ever been to the Octagon House in DC, it's small. And that was the biggest house in DC, like the biggest private house in DC at that time.
Yeah. So I'd love to maybe try to intersect our stories also and tee up what you're working on now, and I guess share with our viewers tonight the fact that when we first met, we were long before the ground had been broken for the Museum of the American Revolution. I was desperately trying to research and get all the information we could about George Washington's tent, its provenance, stories associated with it, and other Washington objects that had come down to us in the collection, including Washington's Commander-in-Chief standard, the flag that, according to family tradition at least, flew over his headquarters, and other items. And of course, Cassie spent a good long summer traipsing through a good bit of the East Coast, both physically and I think on the phone and through email and every other way. And so with that as sort of a tee up, I'd just love to hear a little bit more about this project you're working on now, that obviously intersects very much with this story we're telling about Washington, the tent, the next generation of family members.
Yeah, when I came across, I mentioned in this talk, Nellie, Custis, her sister, Eliza. When I came across them, I was like, who are these people? And then I found out, they're George Washington's step-grandchildren. I was like, well, I knew he didn't have any kids. I didn't realize there was other family. It just never, and even coming across Bushrod, I just had never realized there was other family. So I went to look for a biography. Okay, how do I read about George Washington's family? It didn't exist. And I thought, well, that would be pretty interesting to dig into. How does this person who's the most famous American, the most revered American of his time, how is it that we don't know about his family? And, it's not because there aren't sources. There's plenty of sources. And where this intersects with the tent is that their brother, George Washington Parke Custis, ended up with that tent after Washington's death. And Wash, as his nickname went, Wash was sort of the main keeper of George Washington's memory and legacy. he was the one that was always called to give speeches at public events. And he uses the tent all the time as part of his talks, as part of events he has at his house. We recently, with the help of Sam Snyder from Mount Vernon, who I think is on the call now, found another document where Wash Custis is hanging the canvas from the tents on the walls of the dining room when Lafayette comes over for dinner during his tour in 1824 to 25. And so just seeing the way the family carries on Washington's legacy and does that through objects has been a fun journey. And researching the tent is where I first sort of figured out who all these people were, got a huge family tree, and sort of pieced all that together.
Yeah, it's good stuff. And so there are still collateral descendants, and you're also working with families that are, again, George and Martha had no direct descendants, but through the Custis line, presumably there are still things being unearthed even as we
Yeah,
speak.
so this is Martha Washington's grandchildren from her first marriage. She had 2 children that survived in that first marriage. And then one of them died as a teenager. The other had 4 surviving children before he died very young at Yorktown at the end of the war. And there are still living descendants of the Custises. One avenue I've really been spending a lot of time on is getting to know some of the descendants of enslaved people who were owned by the Custises, and that in particular, we have pretty strong signs are related to the Custises, particularly to George Washington Parke Custis. And that's something that when Arlington House reopens, the Park Service has added that to their interpretation. And, sitting at the table, I was at a dinner with some of those enslaved descendants of the enslaved saying, like, you're talking to a descendant of Martha Washington right here. And
Yeah,
great experience.
Oh, incredible. I'd like to go to one of the questions in the chat from Derek Webb, who was very complimentary of your presentation. I don't know if you can see that, Cassie, or not, but pointing out about Mercy Otis Warren writing under a pseudonym, and is this a phenomenon that you noted for other women in the period of sort of engaging in public political debate?
Yeah, so
Mercy
Otis Warren also uses people were also using pen names and letters to one another. So she and Abigail Adams used Roman pen names in letters to each other and with John Adams. So she was Marcia and Abigail was Portia. And that was because there's an obsession with the ancient Roman Republic among early Americans as another republic built on virtue. And the Roman matron put her country before herself, which, Abigail says at various points, like, I'm not thrilled that I have to do that. Basically, like, that's not always easy to do, but she does it. And so, yes, Mercy Otis Warren is also Marcia. Judith Sargent Murray has a couple of different names that she writes under. There was another female poet that ended up using the same name as Judith Sargent Murray, but it's often sort of Roman Latin names that they're using. But yes, sometimes, and this is a name like Columbian Patriot. Men were also writing under pseudonyms if they were writing sometimes sort of controversial political tracts, or especially any kind of attacks on one another.
Yeah. And maybe Paul has also put the question in, asking, sort of broadening the view comparatively, looking at the rights of women and political participation beyond colonial America, say beyond the geographic area that we're covering. Do you have a sense of putting this period into perspective? And
yeah, I mean, the countries I looked most at for this time period were France and England, which is who people in America, those were the closest countries to America at this point in terms of interrelationships with trade and diplomacy. And in fact, a lot of the way that friendships worked in America was in opposition to the way things worked in France and in England, because the elite in both of those countries, it basically became the expectation that you would have affairs. And so what you see with the elite in England in the late 18th, early 19th century is people who are married are having children with people who are not their spouses, which gets very complicated. If anybody's seen or read about Georgiana, the Duchess of Devonshire, you see these kind of stories. So they're constantly having affairs. In France, it's sort of expected too and people were had multiple lovers at the same time. When Gouverneur Morris took over as ambassador over there, the way he was communicating with the French Secretary of State was because they shared a mistress. And that's how they were getting information across. And Americans were horrified by this kind of thing, because if you need a republic that got virtuous people, well, having affairs is not virtuous. And so part of the sort of worry about these friendships and about sexuality here was like, we are not France and England. We're a republic, we're virtuous. And that includes like not having an affair and having chaste friendships.
Interesting.
But yeah, I mean, certainly these women, in fact, women in England had more political rights than in America. Some wealthy women could actually vote in local elections.
So I'm curious, sort of looking at the time between when you wrote the book, published 2015, and just all seems like so long ago. 2020 seems like so long ago. Just curious, like in terms of the students that you're interacting with, your sense of the field, just, how are questions or insights changing? How do you see the field sort of changing? Been a lot of focus on through Me Too, just the centennial that we've just celebrated, of course, of the 19th Amendment. What are some of the directions that you're seeing this field of inquiry heading?
Yeah, I think actually the place that I'm seeing the most sort of opening up in new directions is the way we talk about race and bringing in slavery into everything we're talking about from this time period. And that's really the thing. When I look back at this book, I think, when I was writing it, I thought, well, how could I include people who are not elite white people? And there weren't a lot of models for how to do that at that point. There were some, but even, if you go to a historic house tour now, especially in the South, you're going to hear about slavery in a way that you didn't 5 years ago, because we figured out new ways to do that interpretation that are much smarter and more interesting than just, do a tour outside and see the slave quarters. Or, if this person wasn't writing about slavery and what you're looking at, then how do you really talk about it? I mean, now I think about the fact that when Jefferson first met Abigail Adams, Abigail, when she's in London, Sally Hemings comes and stays with her. They arrive in London and then go on to Paris. And that's when Jefferson starts his relationship with her. And during his friendship with Maria Cosway, which I talk a lot about, is also probably when he starts his sexual exploitation of Sally Hemings. And now that's so clear to me, and putting those pieces together. And so I hope that people who continue this kind of work are able to bring those kind of insights together.
Yeah. Oh, fabulous stuff. Well, maybe unless there's another question from the audience, I'd love for you to tell us a little bit about your new online course and your experience with Audible.
Yeah, so next week comes out on March 16th. I have a course coming out called America's Founding Women that covers a lot of the themes that your exhibit covers. Has some stories that'll sound familiar, but others that won't. And this course is a 10-part audio series that just covers women and power in this time period. So I talk a little bit about friendships, but I'm talking more broadly too. So there's even 2 episodes on the revolution itself, and how one whole episode on women on the battlefield. How are women actually involved in battles during the revolution? But the course starts, just before the revolution, and goes all the way up to about 1830, where I really see a sort of change. And I see this in my book too, in the way gender relations play out when it comes to politics, because of the rise of two-party system, with the second party system and Jacksonian politics that really changes the way politicking happens. The party apparatus has gotten stronger. There's less room for women. And there's also this growing sense that, that we tend to assume they always thought women should just be in the home. And that is not actually the case. That's a Victorian or antebellum assumption. They're talking about it a little bit in the period I'm talking about. It's sort of transgressive to be doing things outside of the home, but it becomes much more so in this period. And so women have to shift how they operate in politics. It becomes different and more complicated. And so that's sort of where I see the end point here. But yeah, and I'm also happy if anybody else has questions that they want to throw into the chat to ask about.
And to find that, you that's available through Audible and.
There's not a link yet. If you go to my website, which I think they dropped in the chat, I will be updating that with the link to the course.
Fantastic. Well, gosh, I think you've stunned us all into silence. This has been really fantastic. It's great to be able to refresh our friendship, you and I, Cassie, and your friendship with the museum and with all of our friends who've tuned in this evening. I am longing for the day we'll be able to gather again in person. But until then, this is pretty good as well. So thanks to all of you for joining this evening. Please do check out the website, look at our list of upcoming events, and I hope we'll see you all again for Dr. Colley's presentation for the end of our Read the Revolution series. So thanks to all of you, and have a good night and be well.